On you, the former Justice Department official, the author of the so-called Torture Memo during the Bush administration. Let me point out what I think is the most dangerous part of the book, and I think that this is the part that unsettles me the most, which is there is a big difference between a Lincoln and an FDR in that these were genuine wars of national survival or deep, intense national security that were by nature going to be limited in duration. Whereas with the war on terror, this is frankly a definition of an ongoing response to a problem. Margaret Thatcher never called her struggle with IRA terrorism a war. And if the president gets to define this as a war, it is a war with no end. It is a war that will allow for a unilateral expansion of presidential authority beyond the normal confines of the Constitution. And it never ends. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that 35 years from now, there will still be some Al-Qaeda cell somewhere trying to, send some guy into the United States with bombs in his underwear. Does that mean that the president gets to have this massive expansion of power for the next 35 years?
Fried, I think that is, to me, that's the most difficult legal question in all of the war on terrorism issues that we really have not discussed or aired in a very full way. And so I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into that question. And all I can offer is just my take on it, which is, one is that the Congress and the Supreme Court always have ways to prevent the president from going that far. Take all the struggling about the Guantanamo Bay facility now. If Congress wanted to get rid of the Guantanamo Bay facility, they could have done it the next day, just not fund it, right? They could have, what we actually have is the reverse. We have Congress trying to stop the president from essentially closing. And we've had the Supreme Court actually play a much more enlarged role than it ever has historically to extend habeas corpus to Guantanamo. But I really think the legal question you're asking is the hardest. It's a legal and political question. When does a war on terrorism end?
Well, and I think it's really a cop-out, frankly. Not a cop-out, but it's sophistry to say, well, Congress and the Supreme Court can check him, because you know that as a political fact, the president is the single elected official of the entire country. He represents the United States as a nation, and particularly has privileged position on national security. If the president says, I believe this is important for the national security of the United States, it is very difficult, and historically has been very difficult for Congress and even the Supreme Court. As you well know, the Supreme Court basically said, we don't want to get involved in most of these issues. It's an invitation for struggle between Congress and the presidency. So doesn't the president have a responsibility to act responsibly in not trying to declare a kind of open-ended war that would give him an open-ended expansion of his authority?
I agree with you. I mean, I don't think presidents should ever use their power any farther than is necessary to defeat Al-Qaeda. I would not want to see, for example, the economy mobilize or the country go to a total war footing to try to defeat Al-Qaeda. And I wasn't trying to evade your question about, is this really a war? Or if it is a war, is it so different because it doesn't have an endpoint that it raises doubts about how broad we should be in terms of the president's powers? But I do think that it is a war. The problem is we can't figure out how it ends. And so your question is, should the powers go along?
You just said something interesting. It's a war, but you don't want us to mobilize our economy. So in other words, there's clearly you have a very limited conception of what, of how it constitutes a war, which largely involves the expansion of presidential authority on issues relating to wiretapping, torture, and things like that. You don't think it should be a war that allows the president to nationalize private industry, for example, I'm guessing.
No, I'm not saying not legally, but I just think as a matter of policy, I would not like to see that happen. I don't know if it's necessary.
But do you believe this is a war that gives the president the legal authority to do that?
Well, Congress has already passed statutes which would allow the president to do things like that if he declares a national emergency and so on. These kind of powers haven't been triggered since the Korean War. But I think that, I just want to get back to I think it's a really difficult question. When does this war end? Because that's when the powers end. I mean, I'd be the first to say what I'm talking about in this book is really about presidential powers during periods of emergency and crisis. And your concern, which is a difficult one to address, is if you can't define the endpoint, then you're talking about those powers just going on forever.
So 8 years, we're 8 years into the invocation of these powers.
When do we see? When do they ever go?
Can you say 8 years from now we'll have 16 years? This will be the longest war in American history. Can we then say it's over?
Yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, this is what I would offer as an idea is, if we were going to fight a non-state and we're not going to have a signing of the peace treaty on the battleship Missouri, right? We have to figure out when do we think the conflict is over for purposes of our laws or our political system. Is it? I don't think it's when every single person who calls themselves a terrorist has been captured.
So why isn't it over already?
Well, I think when we come to the state where Al-Qaeda is not successfully carrying out operations or attempting to carry out operations against the American homeland in any sort of violent way that would cause a number of deaths.
Well, what does that mean? That cedes the initiative entirely to them. Or you say if they get one Nigerian crackpot on a plane with some chemicals in his underwear, that means we have to suspend the Constitution for that?
Well, first of all, let me just say, we're not talking about suspending the Constitution.
That as a short-term metaphor.
Of course. But I don't want to be on record as buying onto it either. No, but I think, part of it is all built around the threat that the enemy poses, right? The potential harm that can cause the country. And you're right, unfortunately, that some of that has to do with Al-Qaeda, but a lot of it has to do with how successful our efforts are to defeat them. And I think a peace treaty, in a way, when you're dealing with normal nations, plays the role of the other side promises to stop fighting, and they promise to police their own citizens not to attack us anymore. The problem with a group like Al-Qaeda is I don't know if we can ever sign a peace treaty with them.
But then you're saying it'll go on forever.
It could go on for quite some time.
And we're not going to agree on this by the end of this program, but I very much appreciate your coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. And we will be right back.
If the U.S. leader chooses to meet with the Dalai Lama at this time, it will certainly threaten trust and cooperation between China and the United States.
We want to work on issues of mutual concern. I don't think that either country can afford to simply walk away from the other.